What's happening, guys? Hope everyone's doing well. Thanks for tuning in to another Life by Cars video. Today we're gonna be talking about some of the core things that I do to make sure that my car is just generally in good shape. The core aspects of it are mechanically sound and everything's operating as it should be. If there are any problems starting to spring up, I'm going to be able to likely see signs of it showing up through these different checks that I do. So these different things that I'm gonna show you, these different places that I look and the things that I keep an eye out for on a car like this, that sort of thing is really, really important to periodically do. I'll probably do something like this probably once a month on this car because these cars are known to have certain problems. The good thing is those problems are very well recognized. So that means you're gonna have a good idea of what to look for on the car. And usually it's always better to be on top of these problems. You're aware of them as they're coming up because usually they'll compound on themselves. If you have one little thing spring up, it's probably gonna affect another thing. It's probably gonna impact something else, cause a different problem. So it's always better to know exactly what's going on and stay on top of everything. If you guys haven't seen any of my other videos, this is my E92. It's a 2013 335i. So it's a very late build E92 generation BMW. It has, because it's a late build, it has the N55 engine instead of the N54. Some of what I'm going to be talking about here today is just general practices that you should have on any car that you own, whether it be this car, a BMW, or any kind of other car. There are just some general things that you should check for, but I'm going to go also a little bit more specifically into this platform itself, some of the core problems that might come up on this car, and some of the places to look for them. So let's get into it, and we're gonna start under the hood. So the first thing that you're gonna wanna check, very basic stuff, is all your fluids. So you're gonna have your oil, coolant, power steering, brake fluid, all that sort of stuff on this car. This is the coolant reservoir right here. I'm not going to open it right now because the car is hot. I just finished driving it. So this whole system's pressurized. You don't want to open that. You could potentially get hot coolant in your face. So do that when that's cold. This one over here is the power steering fluid. You just open it up, and then on this car it has some lines on that stick, and you just want to make sure your fluid's right between those lines. You can check your washer fluid as well. Obviously that's not quite so important in terms of the running of the car, but in terms of having some windshield wiper fluid, that's always good to check. On the E92s, your brake fluid reservoir is going to be under this cover here, so you can just pop that open. It's right down in there, and you can check that fluid as well. And obviously you're going to also want to check your oil level as well. That's probably the most important fluid in your car. Your engine needs it to be at the right level to run properly and not seize up. If you're familiar with the E92 platform, you'll know that there is no dipstick on this car. Within the engine bay, there's no manual stick, so you actually do it through the computer. Inside the car, it'll tell you the level on the screen there. So that's something that when I'm just driving around, I'll periodically just throw that up on there, make sure that the level's good. For these cars, especially the turbo engines, it's really, really important. Now, if any one of those fluids is low, it probably means that there's a leak somewhere. It does depend on how quickly that level is dropping, how much fluid you're losing. If it's happening slowly over a long period of time, your oil level is slowly dropping, it's either a very, very small leak, or engines like this, cars like this, they slowly burn oil over time. So it can be normal operation, but again, you want to know where it's at. So on the topic of fluid leaks, you're going to want to know the common places on the car that fluid potentially could be leaking from and you could be losing it. We're going to start with the important ones, with the oil leaks. On this car, there are several known spots where oil is going to leak. I'm going to pop this cover off so we have a little bit more visibility. So on this BMW engine, and really on most BMWs, especially the turbo engines, N54s, N55s, really kind of all up and down the lineup, one of the main spots for oil leaks is around this oil filter housing. So this is where your oil filter is. It sits right inside this canister here, and this whole metal housing is basically bolted onto the side of the engine block, just like this. And like I said, this is a really common place for oil to leak. So what you're gonna wanna do is you're gonna wanna just look down in and around here. There's the seam right there where it bolts up to the block. You also get a view up from the front. It's really hard to show on camera. You can look around in the back as well. You would see oil pooling back there if it was leaking. This oil leak happens constantly on these cars. Right now, mine's bone dry because I did my gasket less than 5,000 miles ago. My car currently has 57,000 miles on it. So it was at like 50,000 miles when that gasket already started leaking. That's usually kind of the interval that you're looking at with these oil filter housing gaskets. Every 50,000 miles or so, you're gonna wanna check that area. It's crucial to check this spot periodically because what can happen with the way this leaks and the way it's positioned, the oil will drip down onto your serpentine belt, and then if the serpentine belt gets enough oil on it, it'll slip off of the pulleys and the harmonic balancer kind of blocks it in. And then that really just means that the belt gets shredded and sucked up through the front main seal of your engine. You're gonna have belt shards in your oil pan, you're gonna have rubber in your engine, which is the last thing you want. There are some cases where it completely destroys the whole engine. You gotta get a whole new engine. And there's some cases when it can be fixed, but it's extremely expensive to do that. So check this spot, it's crucial, it's very important. Another common spot for oil leaks on this car is the valve cover gasket. So you can see down in here, this is where the plastic valve cover gasket mates to the metal of the engine. And if you look at it, the whole engine's on a slant. So it's all down on an angle. And that means that when this gasket fails and it starts to leak, all of the leak is gonna happen down along this edge as gravity pulls that oil down. So you can look down in here, you can see mine's nice and dry, which is a great sign. And then again, it's kind of hard to show on camera, but I can look down in between this slot and see kind of along the whole thing, make sure there's no oil there. That's another important one to get to, because on the turbo engines, your turbos are directly beneath that. There's some heat shields and your downpipes are right there. So if you have enough oil leaking out of there, you're gonna be burning oil because it's gonna be dripping down onto those hot heat shields, the downpipes and whatnot, and you're gonna get smoke coming out of the engine bay. So that's definitely a place you wanna keep an eye on. Another common oil leak spot on these cars is the oil pan gasket. You're not gonna be able to see that from on top of the car, but if you ever to get down underneath the car and drop the plastic shield that covers the bottom of the engine, and you see a ton of oil down there, if it's not dripping down the whole engine from one of these two spots that we just talked about, it's probably coming from your oil pan gasket. Again, another notorious oil leak on these cars. So if you see the oil down there, you might have to look into getting a new oil pan gasket. We were talking about the serpentine belt and how oil can sometimes drip down onto it. You also want to check out that belt. You want to make sure that there's no oil on it, first of all, and you also want to make sure there's no cracking in the ribs of the belt. If there's cracking, you want to look at starting to consider to swap it out. I think that's usually every 60,000 miles or so they recommend doing that. Again, it's kind of hard to see on camera, but usually what I do, there's a lot of stuff in the way, but I'll shine a flashlight down right into this area, and that gives you a good view of the ribs of the belt. You'll be able to see if there's any oil on it, because that's where the oil will come down from, and if there's any cracking in there. The last thing I'll mention in relation to finding where leaks are is you also can shine a light down, straight down through this crack all the way down to that engine, that plastic engine shield that I mentioned before. See if that's dry. When I first purchased this car, I found out shortly after that it had a slight coolant leak. My coolant levels were dropping very slowly, so I would periodically shine a light down in that slot that I just showed you, look at the plastic shield on the bottom, and I was able to see that coolant was slowly gathering on one side of the radiator, and dug into it a little bit more, eventually diagnosed a leaky radiator, replaced that, took care of it. But that splash shield will catch a lot of the fluids as they drip down. So if it's wet, if it has stuff on it, it's probably an indication that you might need to look into as some sort of leak. That about covers everything that I usually look for in the engine bay. So the next spots that I check are each wheel and each wheel well. The first thing that I always want to do is check my tire tread, see how it's doing. You can see here I still have plenty of tread, plenty of depth left on these tires. It's not at these tire wear marks that you're supposed to stay above yet, so there's plenty of life left on these tires. And there's also even wear all the way across. One side of the tire isn't worn down more than another, or one edge or anything like that. It's wearing evenly and smoothly. That's really important. If it's not doing that, it might indicate that you have an alignment problem. So I'll do that check on all four corners of the car. For the back wheels, obviously you can't turn them like that. So what I recommend doing is actually getting down behind the back of the car and looking at them from this angle. The reason for that is because you can obviously come into the back here and just kind of feel with your fingers underneath here whether or not there's good tread left. But these BMWs run a good amount of negative camber from the factory as just your standard camber settings in the rear. So that means that the inner edge of your tire is probably gonna wear down faster. I've had cars where I've gone in here and I felt like the first two lips of the tire and there was plenty of tread there, but when I actually went and looked in the back, the whole inner edge was bald. So by looking in the back, you're able to see the whole thing, and you'll be able to see if that inner edge is wearing out prematurely. Next thing I'll check on each wheel are the brakes. So you have to excuse the fact that this car is absolutely filthy right now. It's getting a car wash tomorrow. But when you're in here, shine a flashlight, and again, I don't know if it's really gonna show up on camera, but I can see in there just enough to be able to see how much meat is left on that pad in between the caliper and the rotor to see if maybe that's running a little bit low. Another thing that I'll do is I'll reach in here, and you wanna feel along your rotors. You want this to be smooth, and you don't want there to be a lip on the very edge over here. If there's a lip, that means the rotor's probably been worn down and you might need to replace it. You can see on my car that there's almost kind of these lines that have been etched into the rotor up on the outer portion of it, and that's because this isn't completely smooth anymore, and I do have a decent lip on the edge. So that's telling me that these rotors are almost needing to be replaced, and something that I'm gonna keep in the back of my mind is something that's probably coming down the line. Some more things that I'll do is I'll just kind of stick my head back in here, see how my suspension's doing, see what's going on in here. Make sure that the spring isn't broken, and also make sure that the shock itself is dry. If this is wet and it has oil on it, it's likely because it's a blown shock and it's not good anymore. Basically, it just means that the oil, the fluid that's within the shock that gives it its dampening ability is leaking out, and it needs to be replaced. So fortunately, mine's dry, so this shock is still good to go. In here, you also have your sway bar end link. I have an X-Drive car, so I have my front axles. I look at these, make sure that those boots are in good condition, nothing's torn and leaking. I have my steering boot down here, that's not broken and leaking, so that's great. And really just kind of looking in here, seeing if anything stands out as being out of place, any sort of problems. But right now, everything's looking pretty good, except for a little bit of northeastern surface rust, so that's just kind of the way that we play the game up here, but everything else is looking great. Last thing in relation to the wheels is you also want to check your tire pressures, make sure that those are good. It's good for your tires. Your car's designed to also handle at a certain tire pressure, so if you don't know what your pressures are supposed to be, just go into your driver's side door well, and right here it'll give you on this little sticker what your pressures may be. On my car, I have aftermarket wheels and tires on here, so I run kind of a variation of what those recommended tire pressures are, but that's always a good reference point if you don't know where to start. And then the last thing that I'll do to just finish off the check is just on the inside of the car. I'll come in and I'll use my scan tool to scan the car, see if there's any codes coming up, see if there's anything in the computer that might not be showing on the dash, but something that the computer picked up isn't operating properly on the car. Now, I use BimmerGeek's Pro Tools software through a tablet, and I connect via the MHD Wi-Fi dongle to the OBD2 port. The OBD2 port is right down here next to your trunk release, right down here, so that's where you would plug in. And the great thing about the BimmerGeek's Pro Tools software is that is a tool that is able to scan every single module of this car and give you BMW specific codes for it. So make sure you have a good scanner tool that's going to be able to read the entire car and give you the proper codes. This E92, like if you use a generic scanner, you're gonna get very generic codes, and it won't be nearly as helpful as the BimmerGeek stuff may be. So that covers pretty much everything that I typically do to do it, just a quick check on my car. It takes like 10-15 minutes to go through all those different things, probably less than that, and it makes me feel so much better knowing that I have just a up-to-date standing on just the general health of the car, make sure that I'm confident in the way it's driving, confident that it's not gonna break down at any point, and I'm able to plan ahead should I need to change something out, buy replacement parts, do any repair work. So I highly recommend that you guys are doing this to your cars as well. If you take care of your car, it'll take care of you. Thanks for watching, guys. If you like this video, you found it helpful, please like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time.